Welcome to this tonight's webinar, and it's all about using weeds. So I'm going to talk about three different ways you can use weeds that are growing in your yard. One for soil building, one for food, and then also for medicine or for using various compounds in your weeds that are full of all sorts of phytonutrients and essential oils and other things that are used, and some common ones that are kind of amazing in your backyard to know about. So I will share these. Here we go. So first off, weeds are fascinating. They are hyperaccumulators. So what they do is they grow at a specific time in soil building. So they are early succession plants, meaning that as soils are going from bare rock all the way, say, to mature forest, which is a very highly fungally dominant, like think about those rich, beautiful smelling soils. That's a very highly fungally dominant soil. Whereas bare rock, there's much more bacteria are the easiest ones to survive there. So fast producing bacteria, they're the ones trying to mobilize the nutrients. And the more complex your soil food web gets, the more complexity you get. So weeds are really in this kind of second category, or the ones that we think of the most as weeds are these strong soils. And many weeds are hyperaccumulators, meaning that they are indicators of certain nutrient deficiencies. And they also have like deep tap roots that break through compaction. They're salt tolerant, they're compaction tolerant, they have many characteristics that help bring in nutrients. So lots of weeds put out a super heavy seed set. Those seeds and flowers and nectar and all those things draw in animals and beetles and bugs and butterflies. And what those creatures do is they're essentially nutrient cyclers. So they're adding poop and other different things to mobilize nutrients. And so weeds really, they're rapidly covering the soil as quickly as possible, and they're there for a reason. So if we know what that reason is, you can sometimes then go on and use what they're trying to do to build soils. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and how you can use the weeds that are growing in there, not just to figure out what's happening in your soil, but also use them in different ways. So here's a couple different ideas. And this is just to show you an example of early succession weeds. So if you think about a landslide or a lava flow, there are plants that can pop through lava. Japanese knotweed is one of them. This is a thistle growing through asphalt and a cobblestone sidewalk, but just, asphalt and lava flows similar. So it's just an interesting thing to think about what those characteristics are. This is also a dock right here. Dock tends to have a very deep taproot. And so it can access water far down, but it can also break through compaction layers like clay soils or deep, muddier, siltier areas. So it's just, and it can tolerate a lot of different conditions because it has that deep taproot. So these are very strong, they're active plants, and they are all telling you a little bit about something in the landscape. So using your weeds to grow soil, there's three different ways that I like to use weeds. The first is when weeds pop up, I love to, in some cases, you can pull them out, but another option is to just chop them down where they are and let them fall as mulch on the soil. So I'll sometimes do that. Sometimes I'll pull up the roots if they're aggressive plants that have that'll come back year in, year out. And even if they do, some people love to just keep chopping, and you essentially have your own mulch that's growing up again and again. So if you stay on it, you can keep the roots in there. If you decide to pull them out, you can just leave them on the surface of the soil and let the roots dry out in the sun, and you have a really nice mulch. So if you can do this before they go to seed, that's ideal for not getting them to resprout. However, if you're using your weeds as soil builders, it doesn't really matter if they go to seed or not. So you are working on, by using the weeds as mulch, you're using the minerals that have been accumulated in those plants as a way to jumpstart succession. So that's just kind of a neat way to do that. Also, another thing that I love to do with weeds is I like to take the best weeds in the yard. So these are the weeds that look the absolute best in a landscape. You can take them, just take a bucket and or a watering can, and you can take them and just pop them into your bucket, fill it up with water, let the water sit anywhere for to up to 2 weeks, and then drain that liquid and use that liquid to water your plants, and you're essentially getting a little bit of those trace elements from the weeds. You're also getting a little bit of that beneficial biology that was on the plant. And so you can kind of do this as a way to help increase your weed or the nutrients that what the weed is trying to do. You're increasing that in the soil. So that's another strategy that I like. This is also really excellent to do with nutrient cyclers, like really heavy, wonderful plants that are really rich in minerals. So one of those is nettles. Nettles are really high in calcium. They're high in a lot of different other things that are really important for our bodies, especially women's bodies. But they're also incredibly rich in micronutrients. Another one is in like celery tops, carrot tops, anything in that family. The celery, carrots, cilantro, parsley, all those kind of they're very mineral heavy, so they're high in trace nutrients. Like when you bite them, they almost taste a little salty, like celery seed, and that's kind of an indicator for a higher nutrient amount. And so things like that work really well. But you can also just pick your strongest, your best weeds that look the best and water that, and you can make your own fertilizer that way. Some people will also like to soak these in like vinegars or other things, but water is a very, very simple way to do that. And then also weeds can be indicators for nutrient deficiencies. So one example of this, or biological deficiencies. So a highly bacterially dominant soil will have certain weed types compared to like more of a, if you have a little bit more fungal matter, you'll start getting different weed species as you are changing indicators in the soil. So if you're building up organic matter in the soil, that's that dark, rich, sweet smelling thing in the soil that makes the soil smell really good. It is an indicator, and so certain types of weeds will grow in the presence of more organic matter. Some they'll kind of change as you go. So even if you don't know exactly what the weeds represent, just keep noticing and just start seeing what the differences are. So dandelions, for example, are oftentimes pop up in lawns. It's funnily enough, they are calcium accumulators. So they're really good at pulling up calcium. And a very common thing that happens to lawns is a lot of times people put heavy doses of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So this is a nitrogen fertilizer that like Miracle Grow or other ones, and it actually strips calcium out of the soil. So the more you put it on, it has a tendency to be a little harsh on soil structure, strips out calcium. You create conditions where dandelions want to thrive, and so you're actually creating more and more dandelion habitat, and so they can get more and more aggressive. So many weeds that are problems or super weeds in our fields are actually responding to sometimes pressure we're putting on the landscape or stresses that we're putting in the landscape. And the more and more aggressive and super they become, the more we may be actually creating the conditions that they need to become super. And weeds, in my mind, if you're building up the soil and soil health, you don't have an issue with super weeds, because as it gets more fungally dominant, they just naturally do not thrive. And so that is one way as you're going to kind of shift the dynamic. And I've seen lamb's quarters or other types of weeds start off really strong and aggressive in a garden, and then just start going down and getting smaller and smaller, and or shifting, becoming different types of weeds. So again, thinking about weeds as indicators. Dandelion is also a really wonderful edible. The young greens are bitter, but they're really great for a lot of your body support. Young bitter greens they're wonderful for your liver. They are tasty as the flower tops, as fried fritters. You can roast the roots and make a coffee substitute. There's all sorts of cool things you can do with dandelion. And so it's actually kind of an amazing plant as well in landscapes, and it shows up. And it's also, of course, a wonderful nectar support for a lot of different pollinators, including, this is a hoverfly adult, and the larvae are voracious aphid eaters. So again, it's supporting garden health as well. So this is just a fascinating picture right here of an area early in spring, and you'll notice these are the strongest, most epic weeds. They're actually growing on top of a layer of asphalt so there's just this tiny little strip of soil, probably not the best ever, and they're just growing incredibly green, incredibly bright. There's not a lot of other things. You can kind of see this new green growth at the very beginning of spring growing out, but these guys are doing beautifully. Like they're just crazy. So I would, if I were trying to build up the soil, I would pick the best and the strongest of these, a selection of the plants, fill up a bucket or some small container and just add water, let them sit for a day or two or up to 2 weeks, and then I would water the plants. You can let it sit longer than that, but it will start to get a little bit smelly. The smell will dissipate as it breaks down, so it's not a big deal. But if you have close neighbors that are not as into smelly fermented weeds, then yeah, you can keep that in mind. This one right here, so this is just another example of like a gravel patch, and there's certain weeds popping out of the gravel. So this is an area where there's not a lot of soil, and there's likely, I mean, depending on the weeds, certain weeds can tell you if there's contamination too. So if you are harvesting weeds for eating, I strongly, strongly recommend you are just aware of your soil and what's in it, either by doing a soil test or maybe harvesting weeds for eating in an area like the edges of farm fields are a wonderful place to harvest weeds. Or if you're more outside a city environment or kind of further afield, then you should be fine. But just be aware of that as an issue, especially along industrial sites or urban areas, cities, areas with a lot of old building structures. So you can do this fertilizer, and you can also add, like, say, a tablespoon of molasses into this nutrient rich thing. Not only does the molasses have a little bit of trace nutrients, but it does also have sugar, and sugar is a great way to jumpstart and bump up bacteria growth. So if you have a contaminated site, for example, like an oil spill area that has very, very little growth because a high level of contamination, you can put down a water spray or some kind of spray with a little bit of micronutrient support and also some sort of sugar. And the sugar really just feeds bacteria, which can then start mobilizing and chelating and bringing that biology in. And sometimes it's enough just to jumpstart life. And then once life starts happening, you start getting a buildup of soil and other things that can help buffer and support growth despite an issue. Fungi, once they start coming into the picture, they have the capacity to literally rip apart pollutants like oil or pesticides like DDT or other things. They can literally rip them apart into inert compounds. So if you can get them, and you kind of start by getting the bacteria are the forerunners, and then you just start making the soil food web a little bit more complex as you go. And that's a great way to kind of jumpstart something if you see a piece of land that has no growth whatsoever. So it's great in terms of earth repair or support as well, soil building. So Japanese knotweed is a fascinating weed. It's very, very aggressive, especially on the East Coast. It's considered to be an aggressive invasive plant. But I just wanted to mention also one thing that Japanese knotweed is really good. It looks like bamboo, but it's related to buckwheat. It's edible. The new shoots are edible. And it is oftentimes an indicator of disturbed soils. So that, I think, is a very fascinating thing. This is a picture of Japanese knotweed lining a stream. So Japanese knotweed, another thing that it does really well is it actually pulls extra nitrogen out of landscapes. So if you have a lot of nitrogen, which is oftentimes associated with fertilizer or nutrient runoff or sewage outfalls or all sorts of different things. So if you have a polluted waterway that has a lot of high nitrogen, in some senses, this eroding stream edge, Japanese knotweed rapidly anchors in place. It grows rapidly and it pulls nitrogen, excess nitrogen, out of the landscape. So it's actually, in some senses, an indicator that there is erosion happening, that there's a lot of pollution, and that it is pulling those things from the soil. Japanese knotweed is also been in some studies so it accumulates nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are the three things you oftentimes listed on fertilizer bags. And if you ferment Japanese knotweed in a bucket of water, there are some fascinating studies using it on farm fields instead of animal manure, and having similar results because of its high nutrient load. So This is actually in some ways, so as an invasive plant, it is can really suppress lots of natives. However, if we don't first acknowledge what it's doing, and in the landscape specifically, if we don't correct either the erosion rate or the nutrient runoff, we're still keeping those conditions steady for Japanese knotweed to continue, even if we were to spray it or get rid of it. If we don't somehow have another plant take its place. Another thing Japanese knotweed does is it has these beautiful fall flowers. And so those fall flowers are really important nectar support for a lot of bees. And if we don't have native plants that fill that niche, or have correct some of these environmental conditions around it, or if there's still a lot of disturbance, then you can still, it's very, very difficult to actually get rid of it if you're not acknowledging what's happening or what role it's filling. So that's just something really fascinating. So I've been wrestling with a lot of invasive plants and what are their roles, or what are they telling us? Why are they proliferating over a certain native species? And just trying to get to understand that ecology just a little bit more, to try to create more robust, healthy, and diverse landscapes that are really resilient in those landscapes. So this is Japanese knotweed at a site that I'm working at recently, where you can see as I pull up these little seedlings, we've been putting down tons and tons and tons of wood chips. So wood chips are a wonderful way to smother weeds. They also are a fungal food, woody fungal food. And these Japanese knotweed shoots, you can see they're building soil into the wood chips. They're converting that, they're massive soil builders. So that's one of the other things they do. One of the other roles they have is they are incredible soil builders. And so again, if we're trying to remove the Japanese long term, how can we use what they're doing and also kind of transition? So for example, adding all these wood chips, we're trying to build up the fungal and that stable, beautiful soil. A lot of disturbed forest soils tend to get Japanese knotweed or disturbed sites, but a lot of those solid, fungally dominant forests don't. And I've seen Japanese knotweed stands where they literally are sitting in a forest surrounded by trees and they don't get any bigger. And it's fascinating because they're supposed to be an aggressive weed that spreads no matter what. And really, they are very good at what they do. They can pop through lava flows in Japan. So just understanding what they do. They also are really, really high in resveratrol, which is, the roots are very, very high in the same thing that's in red wine. And there's all these really interesting studies showing how they are actually supportive against Lyme disease. It's just fascinating, and how in some cases for some patients, it's outcompeting antibiotics for Lyme, because the antibiotics have a very specific way of working. But the Japanese knotweed, it has a different function, and it combats it in a different way. So there's a couple different plants that have been under some really interesting studies, and Japanese knotweed is one of them for counteracting the effects of Lyme disease. So that's just a really cool thing to know about. Weeds are, in many cases, soil builders. So they, as I mentioned, they break compaction, they can repair, they sort of assist with all this bacteria or fungi or more complex food webs that start bringing in insects. Those insect exoskeletons, when they die, though, that's rich fungal food, all these different things to try to build up and diversify life in the soil. And so that's one of the roles that weeds have in our landscapes. In some cases, they are amazing food, fiber, fuel, or even more nutrient dense than our commercial crops, which is so cool. So this is just this really neat story. And I'll just mention it briefly, and you can check out, there's a 6-minute video down here. But there's this place north of us, about an hour and a half, where it was a completely barren landscape. There was a zinc refinery in the area. All this smoke basically for years just fell down on the mountainside and basically eroded the landscape quite heavily. And so the mountainside became almost completely barren. Like there's hardly anything growing there. And that became the case for over 70 years. And this was this really heartbreaking thing. The area got listed as a Superfund site, which was really hard environmentally on the community. And then about 20 years ago, this is a totally barren mountainside, literally looked like a moonscape, no trees. They put mushroom compost, they put lime, the limestone to bump up the pH to get it back to growing level. And then they introduced a number of different species to help start mobilizing the soil. Some really hardy early succession grasses, some other things to try to like bind up and get things going. And so they use these plants to then slowly start building up soil. And were able within 20 years, this is the picture on the right, an amazing amount of growth. And some of the trees, which they had thought were completely dead, some of them are here are pretty small, but some of them were much, much larger. The root systems underneath that everyone thought had been dead for 70 plus years, some of them were still alive and they resprouted, and they had massive regrowth and forestation to the point where they rerouted part of the Appalachian Trail to go through this area. So this, in just 20 years, became the site which now has a nature center on it and is slowly working to revitalize this landscape. And the river nearby is the cleanest it's been in over 200 years. And so it's just this amazing story of all these different cyclers. And again, it's kind of this role of weeds. They are really good at what they do, but just trying to look at where they grow and what are the conditions. So they can be used as soil builders very actively. So just in talking about this, like kind of building up fungal diversity and going from a bacterially dominant landscape with weeds to a more fungally diverse landscape, there's a couple different things you can do. So you can do things that feed fungi. So that is like keeping the soil steady, undisturbed, keeping it covered, protecting the soil, like building up some of those deeper things, and also feeding the soil or compost heavier, harder to digest foods. So that's like woody material. It could be exoskeletons. It could be like weird oils in like pistachio shells. Or so I met somebody who used wool that was being landfilled because it was a poor quality wool, and she used it as a mulch, and the lanolin on the wool was a complex fungal food and created these crazy crops with beautiful growth. So that is, again, think about complex compounds or enzymes or other things. And so weeds, even in their very growing habits, are becoming those things. So even those woody stalks, those seed pods, all these things that are a little bit harder to digest, those make great fungal foods. Shredded leaves, all sorts of things are really great. Also bark, buds, twigs, all those different kind of edges that have higher mineral loads than, say, like center bark are really, really great. Like sawdust is kind of high in carbon, but not a lot of nutrition. And so having all these mixed things really does help. And then things that break down or destroy fungal life kind of revert you back to a more bacterially dominant thing. So churning up the soil, spraying it with fungicides, exposing it to weather, so not having it protected. Some people put in little hedgerows or something to protect it from wind, and that's another way to kind of recover, holding water in the soil. So there's lots of different things that can kind of increase fungal diversity and the things that kind of break it down. And so fungi love stable, sturdy things. This is a wine cap mushroom. This is a blonde wine cap, but it is really, really good at being inoculated into wood chips, and it just eats up wood chips and turns them into soil. It's also a really wonderful edible. Usually they're burgundy red. This one is a blonde one, but that you can buy things like this and add them into, they work really well alongside garden plants in a variety of different landscapes. And so anywhere you get the moisture right there, even in the, they had some amazing stories of mushroom success. I don't know about wine caps, but in the Dead Sea area around Jordan. So really cool things that fungi can do, including deal with salt and all sorts of other high, weird, wacky conditions. They sort of stabilize the landscape. So those are different ways you can experience weeds as soil builders. So weeds as food, and many of you probably know this, but a lot of different types of weeds are actually unbelievably high in trace nutrients. So they, in many cases, outperform our commercial crops many, many, many times over in terms of their nutrient density. So getting to know a little bit more edible greens in your landscape and which ones are sort of those early succession plants. So one of the example here is purslane. Purslane is really high in omega-3 fatty acids. That's the same component that's in fish oil. And so this is just this incredible, essentially like a vitamin in your backyard. It oftentimes grows on the edges of farm fields or areas that have somewhat high organic matter, but usually a little bit disturbed, so a little more bacterially dominant. They are in areas where there's sort of hot soil. For example, soil that is turned over, or usually I've seen it in like sandier soil, so well draining soil, and they do really well. So this is just one example of a weed that does well. There's a lot of different flavors in weeds, and I'm just continually blown away. You can pick mild tasting ones, or you can get more intensive ones. But they have a variety of flavors, and in many cultures, these weeds are actually considered high culinary delicacies. So there's one weed called galansoga, which I just found out is also an edible, and it's prized in Mexican cuisine as a cooking green that a lot of people just aren't aware of as well. So it's just all these different plants. Again, so many of them are edible. Look them up and be careful, mindful of harvesting them in places, especially urban areas or places where there used to be an industrial site, because a lot of them can accumulate heavy metals. Not all of them, but just be mindful of just harvesting in areas that are sort of clean soil if you're going to be eating them. So garlic mustard, another aggressive weed on the East Coast that's considered a bane in many areas. However, the leaves they have a bitter but garlicky kind of taste. If you make them into pesto, the oil cuts the bitterness, and the seeds or the leaves are unbelievably rich in vitamin C. So even just eating a handful of them can make a huge difference for your vitamin C intake. They're really great, amazing culinary herb. You can also harvest the seeds and grind them up and use them as a spice. And so a lot of these plants, many parts of them are edible. The roots are kind of spindly. They look like mini carrots, but you can pull them up and you can actually pickle them and use them like you would wasabi or horseradish. And so they have these really strong, incredible flavors that are all around us. And again, just getting to know them, and you start, after enjoying some of these wild flavors, especially even some of the stronger, bitter ones, I actually find I start craving them after a while, which is fascinating. So just thinking about the diversity for your gut microbiome as well. This is another one that, again, Midwest to East Coast, a lot of areas, but it's called autumn berry or autumn olive. This is a berry, it's an invasive plant as well, but you can eat the berries. The berries are tart, but then they go sweet all the way. So they start in August or September, and then they go into November, even December in some areas. They're really high quality berry for wildlife. And so again, if we're trying to switch out these plants for something else, we need to have a high quality foraging item for animals or migrating birds to eat in its place. So thinking about what they can tell us about what's missing in the landscape, or what conditions have made it so that these grow and some of our native plants don't. If there's like sedimentation buildup or whatever it is, it's just a fascinating piece. And they also have, these plants in particular have 17 times the amount of lycopene that tomatoes have. So really incredible plants. I like to harvest them. I freeze them in a tray and then throw them into smoothies, or use them in place of currants. They're very fun, and you can do a lot with them. You can eat the seeds like pomegranates, or you can spit them out, either one. Lamb's quarters is another one that is really common weed, grows all around the world, and oftentimes in moister soils or along creek beds or other areas. And it is it's a higher indicator of a higher organic matter, but it also is very mild tasting, relative of quinoa. So oric is another green, ORACH, that grows in sort of more deserty environments. They can grow high altitudes or low altitudes. And it's, again, rivals spinach in nutrition quality and can be used in all sorts of recipes. Spanakopita is a wonderful recipe that I use all the time for wild greens. And this is just a quick recipe for a wild green juice. So it's basically a wild green, and the more adventurous, you can pick more strong tasting ones, but I usually do mild tasting. A lemon juice, or half a lemon if you don't mind the bitterness of the peel taste. It's really great for you. An apple for adding sweetness, or some other type of fruit, and then a little bit of salt if you want to add electrolyte type stuff to the mix, and water. And so just like pulse it in a blender, and then you can just drink that straight away. But it's a really refreshing, wonderful way to eat a lot of amazing nutrient dense wild greens in a way that's just easy. Fantastic. You'll notice also new grass is on here. So pretty much every single grass species is edible. A lot of our commercial crops are have edible, the grasses are edible. So, and just making sure that you know which one is a grass versus say like a sedge or all, there's all sorts of different types of things, but that those new, when they're really new and young, it's kind of like wheatgrass. They have an enormous amount of chlorophyll and all these different components that are used to make young um, plants grow that are also really good for our bones and blood building and iron absorption, all sorts of stuff. So it's pretty exciting to find these. And then the last one I'll mention is just weeds as medicine. So a lot of weeds and also meadow flowers, many of them grow in a lot of variety of places, and they are highly medicinal. So when I think of medicine, oftentimes in my mind, the way I like to practice this, or I like to find ones that are also medicinal, is I usually pick plants that are also edible. For me, that just is a very safe way to go. So a lot of culinary herbs are highly medicinal, which is fascinating. So things like basil, it's actually really good, and like many different of the Mediterranean herbs are actually really good at calming your nervous system and helping aid digestion. So they have literally physical compounds, some components, sometimes anti-inflammatory, sometimes all these other different antioxidants or other things that actually help your body do something. And so it makes you wonder, especially like Italian herbs, did we attach them to the food, or did like why it's just fascinating because most of them help with like nutrient absorption and digestion and all these other pieces. So it's just fascinating thinking about how our senses work and in pairing those naturally. This is peppermint. Peppermint's a really great, easy one for just calming stomachs that are upset. It's also just a really tasty herb as well. But it's just kind of an interesting thing. So that is actually, let me see. Oh, here we go. This is one of my favorite teas. So nettles, which are again really nutritive, they're wonderful. They have high calcium. They have silicon, other types of different micronutrients that our bodies need in small amounts. And so they're wonderful, but paired with something like Tulsi basil, which is a really sweet, excellent tea in general, it's also supposed to be very calming for your system. And so if you're stressed a lot, it's a great way to help your body not process tons of cortisol in all these different ways. And so again, nutritive and just a nice relaxing end of the day thing. Chamomile is a wonderful herb as well that we are, many of us know as a calming drinking before bed or just any time of the day. And so these are really great options. This is a fun one. So these are just different plants that are really good at repairing skin. So we know about aloe vera. Aloe vera is used commercially for healing from sunburns or burns or other things, but there's a lot of other plants that have those same qualities. So calendula is one of them. It has a resinous flower that if you soak it in oil, any of these like plantain, chickweed, this is chickweed here, and this is a chickweed salve. So essentially what you do is you soak your plant that has this quality in an oil, and then you mix part of that oil, let it sit for a week or two in the sun, or so it kind of infuses and you get a little bit of that, some of those essential oils or other components into the oil, and then you mix 1 part of that oil with 1 part beeswax, and you can test the texture and temperature, but you can make your own chapsticks, you can make all sorts of different things. And so plantain is also a really great one. So if you ever get stung by a bee out in the field or hit stinging nettles in the fields or anything like this, you can just chew it up and actually just put the leaf against your hand, and it'll actually reduce the swelling quite substantially. So if you have a kid that has a bee sting or other thing, you can even wrap the leaves around. Prickly pear flowers also have a similar component as aloe. So these are just different options for simple, easy. All these are edible as well. So it's just kind of a neat thing to be able to do. And I think, let me just see if, I think that's actually my last one. Perfect. Yeah, so these are just different options, and they make a really great way to support your garden. There's so many different plants out there that also do wonderful things for your landscape. and for your health, and are just wonderful and nutrition oriented. So they're wonderful to try on.